We're going to finish the 8th chapter of Shabbat today. And we start just by continuing along with our list of objects. We're trying to define the critical quantity required to be obligated to bring a chatat if we carry it on Shabbat. And remember, the general rule is that if the quantity is a useful quantity, it's sufficiently significant to be asur for or for you to be chayav chatat, for us to be chayav chatat if we carry it on Shabbat. If it's a significant quantity, if it's a useful quantity, it's significant for carrying on Shabbat, and we're not going to carry it outside the Erev. So we went through a long list of items yesterday, including light sand and thick sand and reeds, whether they were good for making a pen or maybe just good for heating up for fuel. And now we're going to go for bones. Etzem. Kedei la'asot tarvad. A bone as much as is required for making a spoon. A tarvad is a spoon. Rabbi Yehuda says, Kedei la'asot mimenu chaf. Rabbi Yehuda says, enough to make a chaf. A chaf can be all kinds of things, but in this context, it seems to be the bit of a key. People used to carve their keys out of bits of bone, I guess, to be able to carve it accurately. That's a tiny quantity of bone, but that's essentially, that defines the minimal quantity. Zechuchit kedei ligror borosh hakarkar. You might use glass to scrape the end of a shuttle in loom, to scrape it out as a sort of a polishing up thing. Tiny bit, again, we're talking about a tiny bit of glass. Straw or evan, a pebble or a stone. Kedei's rock but off. You might want to throw that at a bird. It's interesting. I think if you kill the bird in this way, I mean, clearly you can't eat the bird, right? If you killed it by throwing a stone in it, but people will maybe want to scare it away or keep it off your crops or your fruit. Anyway, a stone that's sufficient to throw at a bird. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is a slightly more makil, slightly more relaxed. He says, Kedei's rock bivhemma, enough to throw at an animal. So for him, the minimal quantity on a stone is a slightly larger stone.
But
what about,
when it comes to a child, it says somewhere else in the Mishnah that if you carry your child and he's carrying a stone, it doesn't give a quantity of how large that stone is.
Oh, that's interesting. But that's a child who's below, presumably a child who can't walk, or child below the age.
So I'm asking if why there wasn't a qualification of how large the stone was.
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, perhaps this is the chapter where we define the quantities. Maybe because this is a chapter where we define the quantities. I'm not sure. It's a good question. We'll come back to it maybe when we come back to the child. Cheres kedei tenbein patsim lechavero. You could. What about a pot shard? This is a broken piece of pot. So maybe if you are arranging two boards, you might use a pot shard between the two boards in order to arrange them, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Anyway, so there's a broken piece of pottery. You might use it in construction. And Rabbi Meir says, enough to scrape out coals with. And Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi says, look, if you had a potsherd, you would use it to hold water. And a riv'it is a minimal quantity of water for halachic purposes. We learned that earlier in terms of carrying on Shabbat. So if the riv'it is the quantity for carrying, the potsherd that can carry the riv'it is a minimal quantity of pot. And now we're going to get into the question of proof. How do we know these are the right measurements? And Rabbi Meir says, I can't prove it from this pasuk, but I'm going to quote you a pasuk. I'm going to quote you a pasuk from Yeshayahu. It's an angry pasuk. It's talking about destruction, and then it says, "Velo yimatse bi muchtimto cheres lachtot eish miakod." There's going to be no shard left in order to scoop coals from a brazier. And then the pasuk goes on to say, "Ve'lachsof maim migeve," and there won't be any potsherd left over to ladle water from a puddle. So the verse in Isaiah talks both about using the potsherd to scrape out coals and using it to ladle water from a puddle. Yeah, Isaiah uses both metaphors. So Rabbi Meir says, look, I can prove I'm right from this verse in Yeshayahu, in Isaiah. And Rabbi Yossi comes straight back and he says, no, I can use the second half of the same verse to prove exactly the opposite point. And that is the close of chapter 8. It's you could almost call it a teku. There's an existential doubt as to how we prove these halachot, and the verses are indeterminate. And that, of course, that is one of the existential questions which the generation of Rabbi Meir is struggling with. These are the generations that are just after the move to Yavne, and they're asking, well, how do we know we're observing the right halakha? Is it because we're doing what our tradition has taught us? That's, if you like, the derech of Rabbi Eliezer. Is it that we can learn rationally from the psukim? Maybe that's the derech of Rabbi Akiva. In this case, the psukim seem to give us an incorrect steer. And the Mishnah now, in the beginning of chapter 9, is going to go through a set of other examples where we seem to be able to get guidance from the psukim, but there's no proof. So we're going to go through a sequence of Mishnayot where there seems to be guidance from the psukim, but there's no proof really. And then once we've embarked on this little discursus, we're going to get back to the question of quantities on Shabbat. So that's what we're embarking on now in chapter 9. So I just brought you the verse from Isaiah on the source sheet. That's the whole verse. And let's have a look at the beginning of chapter 9. Amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said, "Minayin la'avodah zarah shehi matama b'masa kanida." How do we know that an idol defiles by being carried? And Rabbi Akiva is not talking about touching the idol here. He's saying, let's say the idol was in a bag or on in some kind of container, and you picked it up and you carried it. The idol makes it makes you tameh just because you are carrying it, even though you're not touching it. That's the question that Rabbi Akiva is dealing with. And by the way, he seems to know the halakha. He knows. He says, how do we know that the idol defiles by being carried? He knows it defiles by being carried, but he needs a pasuk. And Rabbi Akiva is classic of the he's a classic example of a sage who learns from psukim, and different ones are different ones. Hillel comes to Yerushalayim from Bavel, and they ask him what to do when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat. How are we going to bring our Pesach offerings to the temple? How are we going to bring the knives to the temple? Because the Pesach offering can walk, but the knife can't. And they know the halakha is that you shove the knife into the hair of the lamb, right? And the lamb carries it. They know the halakha is that like that. But Hillel drushes them for 3 days, and they don't agree with him. They don't take a drush as they are now taking from Rabbi Akiva. And then eventually, at the end of 3 days, he says, "Kach v'kach lamadti mi Avtalion mi Shemai ve'Avtalion." Thus, I learned from my teachers Shemai and Avtalion in Babel, and then they accept it. So, in the case of Hillel, they take the tradition in a situation where they are not prepared to take the drush. Here, Rabbi Akiva is saying Minayin. How do we know? He's not giving the tradition. Clearly, he knows there's a tradition. He's giving us the drush. And now he's going to quote again from Isaiah. I think it's not a coincidence that he's quoting from the same Perek. So we're in Perek Lamed in Yeshayahu. We're actually on Pasuk 14. So we're halfway through the Perek. I think this is the connection. I mean, it's hard to see the connection between the end of chapter 8 and the beginning of chapter 9. I think the connection is probably in the Perek from Yeshayahu, which is being quoted. So Rabbi Akiva, so we're laterally, if you like, we're laterally associating to other halachot we can learn in the same way. So he's going to quote another pasuk from our Perek, Shenemar Tizreim. How do we know that a idol passes on tumah like a woman who's niddah, who, if she's sitting on, let's say, a sofa, will pass on tumah to that sofa, even if she's not touching it? How do we know? Tizreim k'mo davar. And now he's talking about, the prophet is talking about casting away the idols. You shall cast them away like a davar. Davar in Eicha means someone who's sick, but in this context in Yeshayahu, it seems to refer to a niddah, seems to refer to a menstruant. Tizreim k'mo davar tzei tomar lo ma nida b'tumah b'masa af avodah zarah mutama b'masa. The prophet says you shall cast them away as a menstruant. Say out tomorrow. Get out, I will say to you. And then Rabbi Akiva continues, just as a menstruant defiles by being carried, so does an idol defile by being carried. So he's going to learn one from the other. And then in the following Mishnayot, we're going to learn a few more examples where, so rather tangentially, we're learning a halakha from a pasuk that we're going to learn a halakha we know, or we're going to attach a halakha we know already to a pasuk to give it more grounding.